It took just seconds for a routine traffic stop to turn deadly. And today, graphic video of the encounter was made public just a few days after a Minnesota police officer was found not guilty of manslaughter. Mireya Villarreal reports.
The newly released dashcam video shows the moment when Officer Geronimo Yanez stopped Philando Castile for a broken taillight last July, first asking Castile for his license and registration.
I have to tell you, I do have a firearm on me.
Don't reach for it then. Don't pull it out.
Don't pull it out.
Within 90 seconds of making the stop, the 29-year-old officer fired 7 shots.
Did you catch that? Lamar stated his views on police brutality with that line in the song, quote, "And we hate the po-po, want to kill us in the street, faux show." KG.
Ah, please. Ugh, I don't like it. I mean, you know I don't like it. That's why he came to me. I get it. That's his right to express himself. Let the free market decide. Personally, it doesn't excite me. It doesn't turn me on. Doesn't interest me. I'm not feeling it.
Harala, not helpful with those song lyrics.
To say the least. Not helpful at all. This is why I say that hip-hop has done more damage to young African Americans than racism in recent years.
Slavery in the United States began with the arrival of 28 odd enslaved African Americans to the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The slavery movement was massive and forced African Americans to work for free and be owned by white men in the United States. Black men were raised to farm, become caregivers, and to do all the hard work and dirty work that white men and women did not want to do. Black African American slaves were to be whipped, tortured, and sometimes killed if they didn't do their job or what their master had them do as a task or wasn't efficient enough within the certain job. Slavery was then banned and ratified with the 13th Amendment in 1865.
Since slavery was introduced, people have always fought for their rights. One of the most important cases that helped to recognize African Americans' rights was Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson case. Plessy v. Ferguson established that separate but equal accommodations were acceptable for minorities. However, Brown allowed for the beginning of desegregation in the U.S., starting with the school system. This marked the beginning of improvement of human rights given to the African Americans and other minorities in the U.S.
Executive Order 10925, signed by President John F. Kennedy on March 6, 1961, required government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. This at the time was a huge movement for black and colored communities because it opened doors for jobs and opportunities. Affirmative action was mainly focused on equal opportunity of education and employment.
This country began at a point where racial discrimination and mistreatment of African Americans was a part of everyday life. The idea that everyone who was white was more entitled to human rights than those born of color brought forth new ways to display their superiority. The Jim Crow laws beginning in 1865, following the 13th Amendment, which freed 4 million slaves. Although the 13th Amendment freed those people, those opposed to this ratification began putting in place laws and restrictions such as black codes and forming racist groups such as the KKK. The Jim Crow laws and other restrictions were put in place separating the blacks from whites and in determining where and how they could work and for how much they could be paid. All of this was used to keep black people in debt and effectively working for the white landowners at low rates.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and guys like Cesar Chavez started the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a black activist who was seen as one of the biggest voices in the black community and became an iconic voice in history of the United States. Cesar Chavez was an American labor leader and civil rights activist who co-founded National Farm Workers Association in 1962. He is seen as a guy who led the Latino community the way Martin Luther King Jr. did, but in many different ways. Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave a big chance in racial discrimination. This act gave government more control over discrimination to citizens based on their color, race, gender, national orientation, religion, and sexual orientation, along with others. This act also prohibited the unequal applications of voter registration requirements and segregation in schools, employment, and public events. To continue momentum in the right direction, Voting Rights Act of 1965 became one of the most... We can just cut it off after it continues.
Wait, hold on. I want to play Marco's back. Wait.
To continue momentum in the right direction, Voting Rights Act of 1965 became one of the most important acts of civil rights. Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, this became the legislation that guaranteed the Black, Latino, Asian, and Arab and every single minority race and nationality had a right to have a voice in the community and vote. This act started to gain momentum when black communities marched in a peaceful protest in Alabama, which ended up being shot up by state troopers. This began to be known as Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday helped the civil and voting rights movements and essentially guaranteed the right to vote under the 15th Amendment of the Constitution and gave an advance to racial diversity that was very needed in the southern states.
Since 9/11 occurred, which killed almost 3,000 people in a radical Islamist attack, the attitude towards the Arab community has shifted to hate. A Pew Research Center survey found that many Americans think a substantial segment of the U.S. Muslim population is anti-American. Half the public believes that at least some U.S. Muslims are anti-American. Even further, 46% of the American population believes that Islam is more likely than other religions to encourage violence. A ritual of fear has been stimulated in American culture, a fear that has resulted in discrimination towards the Muslim community. This has even been shown in American foreign policy in regards to Trump's ban on Muslim countries. Often most Muslims are thrown into one group, religious extremists, and most fail to realize that there's more than just that. Many different communities of color barely impacted discriminatory enforcement of drug laws. Some of the most egregious racial disparities can be seen in the case of African Americans and Latinos. Higher arrests and incarceration rates for these communities are not reflective of increased prevalence of drug use, but rather of law enforcement's focus on urban areas, lower income communities, and communities of color. Misguided drug laws and harsh sentencing have produced profoundly unequal outcomes for communities of color. People of color experience discrimination at every stage of the criminal justice system, and are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, convicted, harshly sentenced, and saddled with lifelong criminal record. This is particularly the case for drug law violations. Nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are black or Latino. Research shows that prosecutors are twice as likely to pursue a mandatory minimum sentence for black people as for white people charged with the same offense. Among people who received a mandatory minimum sentence in 2011, 38% were Latino and 31% were black. Other racial groups are also impacted by the drug war, but the disparities with these highlighted groups are particularly stark and well documented. Bakke decision, formerly Regents of the University of California v. Bakke ruling, in which on June 28, 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court declared affirmative action constitutional but invalidated the use of racial quotas. The Supreme Court, in a highly fractured ruling, agreed that the university's use of strict racial quotas was unconstitutional and ordered the medical school admit Bakke, but it also contended that race could be used as one criterion in the admissions decisions of institutions of higher education. Although the ruling legalized the use of affirmative action in subsequent decisions during the next several decades, the courts limited the scope of such programs, and several U.S. states prohibited affirmative action programs based on race. This coincides with the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. It is a constitutional guarantee that no one person or group will be denied the protection under the law that is enjoyed by similar persons or groups. In other words, persons similarly situated must be similarly treated.
The election of Barack Obama was significant to the progression of minorities representing different cultures because it broke the wheel and showed an African American man to become president. where in the past it has only been white men. His nomination was a symbol to the rest of the country that the progression of the nation was still moving to represent different minorities, and how it is still open to positive change. In President Barack Obama's speech on race at the National Community Center in 2009, he said, "Two wars, a terrorist threat, a failing community, a chronic healthcare crisis, and potential devastating climate change. Problems that are either black or white or Latino or Asian, but rather problems that confront us all." His speech focused on not the separation and the problems that divide Americans, but instead on the problems we should be focusing on together, attempting to further bridge the cultural gap in the nation.
We went around school and asked people how they felt about cultural representation in modern day racism.
Alright, so what is your name and age?
I am Ariana Stalum and I'm 17.
Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
Yes.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
Probably not, because they don't really see it as wrong, but maybe others are like, yeah, I'm racist, I don't care.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
I don't think so. Maybe for being blonde or young, but not because of my color.
What is your name? What is your age?
My name is Kamwana Wah and I'm 18 years old.
Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
Yes, sir.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
No, not always, because usually they kind of use it as a joke or something, and they don't think they're doing anything wrong, but they're really hurting the people they're discriminating against.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yeah, in sports and sometimes in everyday life.
What is your name and age?
My name is Robert Adam Karleski, and I am a freshman at CV.
What is your name and what is your age?
My name is Gabe Wilson, and I'm 15.
What is your name and what is your age?
Daniel Valenzuela. I'm 18 and a senior in high school.
Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
Yeah, I do believe to an extent it's still openly used. You know, you see it on the news and stuff, but often it's characterized as something else other than just racism.
Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
I do. I believe that racism is openly used.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
I feel like everyone has a sense that they're racist to an extent, you know, just a sense of guilt, but for most people it's a guilt they overlook.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
No, I feel like it's kind of just a social norm by now.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yes, several times.
Why?
Because of my religion, actually.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
Some people do. I imagine I see this a lot on the internet. Some people do it to be funny. Other people have just been, imagine the older generation have a lot harder time with this as they grew up in a generation where racism was just second nature and probably ingrained into them. So there are some people who probably don't think that they're racist, but I imagine there are also some who are conscious of the fact that they're being racist but say it anyways.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Not for race. I was an awkward kid in middle school, and so I was kind of the oddball out there, but not really in the same fashion as racism.
Okay. What is your name and age?
I'm Simone Moulton. I'm 15 years old.
Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially systemically, racism is really prevalent, and but it's getting less acknowledged. People are saying, like, oh, we had a black president, racism doesn't exist, but it's that saying those things is just indicative of just how underlying and embedded it is in our society.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
No, not all people, because I think discrimination comes in a lot of forms, and you don't always acknowledge it, and people don't really want to acknowledge it. It's an ugly word, but it's a word that we need to acknowledge in general.
And have you ever been discriminated against?
Yeah, I think so. I think just you can't really go throughout life as a female, as a not white person, without experiencing discrimination of some sort.
What is your name and age?
John Atwood, 59.
Okay. Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
Openly used?
Yes.
I believe it's still a problem.
Okay. Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
Yes, often, but not always. I mean, I think some people discriminate without realizing it.
Okay. And have you ever been discriminated against?
I believe so. Can't prove it.
Okay. What is your name and what is your age?
My name is Kevin Friedman and I'm 51 years old.
Okay, so do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
It definitely is. We see a lot more of it these days even than I think we used to when I was younger.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
Not all the time. Sometimes people seem to not see their discrimination as being racist.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yes, I have. When I was growing up, I grew up in South Texas in Corpus Christi, and I experienced what it was like to be in the minority. The school there was mostly Hispanic. There were a handful of us that were not, so it was eye-opening in hindsight, especially to kind of experience it from the other side.
What's your name and age?
My name is Cole Loriano. I'm 18 and a senior in high school.
Do you believe racism is still openly used in the United States today?
I don't believe openly, but I think it's still a pretty big part in our culture, even if we don't openly admit it.
Do you believe people who discriminate towards people of color consider themselves racist?
I don't think anybody considers themselves racist. They just have been either just open about it or like not open about it, but they just talk about it and don't realize what they're saying.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yes.
Alright, final question. Do you believe you've ever been discriminated against?
Yes.
Fly, want you to fly, want you to fly, want you to fly, here we go. Want you to fly, want you to fly, want you to fly, want you to fly, here we go. Want you to fly, want you to fly, want you to fly, want you to fly, here we go.
His body is whole and made whole, God. That any and all things trying to come against her, Father God, shall be cut down right now in the name of Jesus.